Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground is brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Common Ground is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4, 2008. Hi, and welcome to Common Ground. I'm your host, Ashley Hall. Common Ground captures the creative process of various artists living throughout our region. Each week, we delve into the veiled history of our area. Plus, we take you inside the cultural events that put the North in North Country. On this week's episode of Common Ground, using photography, technology, patience, and a little skill, Jim Kasper of 50 Lakes creates beautiful wildlife paintings. Noel Mills of Backus shows us the art of violin making, and Audrey Merschman of Bemidji paints a garden scene.
I'm Audrey Merschman, and I have lived in Bemidji for 7 years, and started painting about 30 years ago, not seriously, but just for fun. So far, I've gotten the background, and I'm going to put in some more leaves so I can put contrast with the darker. One wonderful thing about oil is you can take a knife and scrape it off and start over if you mess up. Just keep adding leaves until I get somewhere where I want to be. I paint a lot with blues and pinks and stuff because they're my comfort colors. So every once in a while I have to get out of my comfort zone and go with colors I'm not used to. And I use Q-tips to soften and to remove or to add. The only thing I copy to make it look the same is I have done portraits of all my family. And of course they have to look like the person. And you have to capture the personality in order that they look real. But other than that, I kind of, as I've painted, want to have them be a reflection of me and what I do. I've been just blessed, have something to fill my days now that I'm older. Never in my life thought I would be able to go into a store and have commercial cards with my name on them on a rack, and have Christian books for children that I have illustrated, and to have a family who appreciates and has encouraged me, and who has their house full of my work. I always have to stand back and see what I've done. That's why many times I'll leave and I'll go do something else, because I'll come back and I'll think I like it or I don't, and scrub it out or add to it. There's no perfect picture for everybody. Everybody's got different colors that they love and different styles. My husband always said, why learn to paint like somebody else? Learn to paint like yourself. Let the brush do for you what you like it to do. While maybe taking lessons, it would go faster because you learn to mix, you learn to do this other stuff. But there's been a lot of satisfaction in knowing that yours is kind of unique too, and that it isn't what everybody else does. There were many people I knew that took lessons that were a lot better than I, but the secret is persistence. Keep doing it. The people who love to do it don't care if they're not quite as good as the next person. They keep doing it. And that makes you improve, and it gives you your own style.
My name is Noel Mills. I'm a retired heart surgeon, and I have a shop where I make violins and cellos and violas I got interested in violins when I read an article in Scientific American in 1963. And I said, I'm going to make me a violin. And I read the article maybe 5 times. I was an intern at Columbia Presbyterian in New York. And that year I got married. Kennedy was killed. When my wife and I had a chance to go upstate New York to get some wood, I went and bought some wood, and I carried it with me for 40 years because I never had a chance to build a violin. But it was still in the back of my mind. During the Vietnam War, I actually took the wood to the 25th Casualty, thinking maybe during the nights or what have you, I'd have time to carve on it, but it just never happened. I had to retire completely before I started making violins. This is a piece of spruce, which is what is usually used for the top plate, and this is flamed maple, and you can see the flames here in the hard maple, and that's the usual type of wood that's used for the back and also for the sides. And of course, when this is stained and varnished, these flames will come out and be much more prominent. Another name is fiddleback maple. Nobody knows what causes. They have to cut the tree down and look before they know whether it's going to be in there. You can see this spruce front has been cut and book halved, so to speak, and here's the junction of where it is glued together. So that would be the front. Here again is the so-called fiddleback, and you can see the curls, and this actually is basswood from Minnesota, and the person cut this down in his yard and didn't know it, but happened to recognize the fact afterwards that indeed it had curls in it and would possibly make a real good tone wood. Okay, this is a piece of tone wood. As you can see from the front, it's curly maple. You can see the curls in there. Once again, this would be for the back, and you can see how this is opened up so that what you would do would finish the cut right here, which is about a couple of 3 inches, and then take one side and you would turn it around, smooth these edges very precisely, and glue those 2 edges together. So it would be so-called book matched. While we're talking about wood, I have a friend in New Zealand, and that friend told me that he was going to send me some special wood, and there's a tree in New Zealand called a kauri tree. They're rare, and it's against the law to cut them. The early settlers just wiped them out. It's a very hard wood, and now the only way you can get kauri wood is to take and pull one up out of the marsh, just as is done in Louisiana with the bald cypress. They call them sinkers. Well, he sent me the wood, and this is a piece of this kauri wood, and this is made into the back because it's similar to the maple insofar as transmission of sound across a grain and with the grain. And this piece of wood actually was carbon dated, and it's 40,000 years old. Now, this particular piece of wood, if you can notice, the lines of growth are extremely close together. And this is bald cypress. It comes from Krotz Springs, Louisiana, and was pulled up out of the marsh. And lo and behold, it has a fairly good ring to it when you carve it out. And I made one of this kauri wood back and a sinker bald cypress several years ago. And a lady who's a fine violinist in Mankato has that violin. As she brought it back up here after 3 years of playing it, and I stopped everything I was doing and started making a second one because I happened to have a second piece of kauri wood available to do that. Well, how did the old boys make these wonderful sounding instruments? That is really an enigma. And there are many, many theories as to why they did that or how they did that. Now, for a long time, they thought maybe the varnish was the secret of Stradivari and how he had this wonderful violins that he could make. But then that kind of went by the wayside, and more recently a theory came up that the reason why his wood was so good was that it was floated down the rivers and became mineralized. And then that theory kind of dropped by the wayside, and people looked at dendrochronology and they looked at climate, and they said, well, it looks like his wood is so good because he lived just after a mini ice age, and the grain in the wood was very, very, very close together. But even now there's a more current theory. There's the theory that there's a fungus that gets into this wood and actually changes the lignin, and that gives it a very special sound. So the truth of it is that that's an ongoing research project which has been going on for 100 years and will probably go on another 100 years, although many of the high-end, the really good violin makers with physics may be making violins that are going to actually be better than what the old boys like Stradivari and Guarneri were able to come up with. We just don't know. On this piece of wood, which is incompletely carved out, it's not finished, how much do you gouge out? How thin do you leave it? Well, there's a number of ways to determine that, but one of the ways to determine how much is gouged out is by using what is known as Chladni patterns. And you sprinkle glitter on a violin plate, and then this is over a speaker, which is right under here, and you turn on the speaker and you slowly increase the hertz of the speaker. And at a certain point, the glitter will begin to vibrate and will make a pattern. And that pattern will be still with the glitter at a point where there's a node that is a part of the violin that's not moving, and then the antinode will be the point where the glitter is bouncing. And right now that's E flat. So all of this will go into my data book as I'm working on this plate to carve it to the precise thickness. This tells me that I can do a little bit more insofar as taking wood from certain areas in this region and that region, and I'll do that and then retest. And I may not take but 1/10 of a millimeter or 2/10 of a millimeter of wood by scraping very carefully until I get precisely what I want insofar as the pattern and also the hertz. Well, what I do with the violins is through word of mouth, someone will hear that I make instruments and that I may give them away, and I find somebody who, is somewhat of a reasonable violin player. I don't mean some wonderful person, but a young person maybe, or someone who's even older and just needs a violin. I talk to them and make a decision whether one of my violins would fit their needs, and if it does, then I give them the violin on a consignment. I make a serious thing out of it, not just hand it to them. And the consignment says, number one, that they're not going to sell it, crush it over their little brother's head, or they're not going to lend it to somebody, or they're not going to, misuse it. Now, every violin gets nicks and dinks and stuff like that. That's part of having a stringed instrument, but you know what I mean. And then the second thing is they agree that they'll put it on their homeowner's policy, again, to show the seriousness of it. And then next, they can have and play that violin as long as I'm alive. When I die, my family has the option of, number one, letting them have it and continue to play it. And probably that's what's going to happen to most all of them. And the second thing is, if my family decides to sell the lot, then that person who has the instrument has first right of refusal. And so in that way, it's kind of win-win for everyone.
I'm basically a wildlife painter, though I have had commissions for people, pets, sporting dogs, and that sort of thing, but wildlife makes up the bulk of what I'm about. I just returned from a trip west where I gathered some photo research in anticipation of finding something that's truly exciting to paint. This is something that I started a day ago, and it is essentially an event that caused me great excitement at sunrise. When the first light started hitting these bison, I went, wow, that's something I'd like to share with other people, and that's what my wildlife paintings are about. It's giving folks who don't necessarily have the opportunity to be out and about and viewing wildlife a chance to really see the beauty that nature provides. I do a lot of background work on the computer, and I'll take an image. Let's say this here was something that really excited me, that lighting and the bison, an arrangement that was kind of interesting to view, and the foreground rock and so on. But as a painting, it lacked more emotional elements. So on the computer, I played around with different additional levels of background. And there's an image here that shows a couple different early sunrise vistas. And so I decided to incorporate that as part of the composition. I play with the elements and I go back and forth changing the lighting in subtle ways of adding more contrast or more warmth or whatever I think it needs. And when you bring elements in that aren't part of the original image, you have to make sure that they also have the same light temperature. So it may result in my having to lighten or darken, let's say, this bull, add warmth to it. And in some ways, the computer has now become my real creative tool and the real joy, because things happen so quickly as compared to years ago when I used to do this all with pencil and paper and lay things out that way. It was a very time-consuming process. Essentially, I start out by drawing, and there was underdrawing on all of this to put the individual bison in, where the horizon line is, components like this that I thought are a nice color addition, and I first like to block in those areas so that, again, my composition is being satisfied in my mind that, okay, these percentages of space are comfortable to me. And then I go ahead with adding all of the individual textures and color changes and so on. If I wanted to add something here and show the grasses with the brush strokes, I could go in and be very tediously trying to replicate the grasses that I'm seeing on this prairie. Or I could come in and I go, wow, I've put in that as a backdrop, and I go, wow, that's a little bit too cool. I'll add some warming elements to it. And it allows me to be, I guess it's almost like scribbling, but it's the underlaying area that gives me the basis, the building blocks for future parts of this painting. Also, I can introduce colors that are exciting to me as an artist that cumulatively, when they're viewed from a distance, will become grass. But it contains many different colors to get to that, as opposed to just mixing up a color that goes, well, I got to get exactly this green, gray, purplish look, I can just pull this stuff in from all over the place with this kind of a brush. And I don't worry too much about it, because later I can come back in and I will come over the top with layers and layers. And that's one nice thing about acrylic. It's like a layering of transparent washes. But this is really the fun part, because it's so free and it allows you to play with color. I've said time and again that the best way to get the enthusiasm and the excitement to create a painting is because it happened in front of you while you were in that natural situation in nature. And that's the ultimate creator for my work as a painter. Well, I've been always, I guess, an artist, just never fully understanding what that meant. As I matured through the school years, I always liked drawing and painting, though I didn't do that much of it. But I liked the out of doors and the natural world. I would go to the woods after school when some kids would go to the ballpark, and I loved to be down by the creek. And it took many years for all of that to really come to a realization that, you know, there must be something here that I can use to create a living. I realized I needed to go to have further schooling, so I went to Minneapolis College of Art and Design. And knowing that ultimately I had to go into the real world and make a living, I thought, well, what can I do? And it was made easy for me by a scout coming to the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and he was recruiting artists for the greeting card business. And though some artists felt that that was beneath them to pursue that, I had a wife and 2 children and I needed a paycheck. And so I was moved to Kansas City. I became one of the creative people in the art department, generating the greeting cards. It was probably my most important learning process in my whole life, in that I met and worked with some of the absolutely finest artists in the country. I learned more about painting in my time at Hallmark than I did in art school. But art school in reality was sort of a clearing ground. It sort of erased what you thought you knew about art and gave you a new foundation to build on. And that foundation was built on extremely well at Hallmark. I took what I knew from there to northern Minnesota, where I started working with a small printing company doing graphic arts. My painting efforts were really put on the back burner for many years, and I finally said, if I'm going to be an artist in the fine arts and paint, I need to do something that makes it easy for me to do painting anytime I am up to it. So I set up an area in the basement and had a palette with everything ready, being able to put a cover on it so that anytime I wanted to come down and paint, even if it was for 10 minutes, I could take the cover off and start painting on something that I thought was worthwhile. And that's what I did. And finally, 10 years after Hallmark, I started painting. And of course, the subject matter was naturally wildlife and the natural world. I had early, very successful sales of the limited edition prints, and started doing shows in the Twin Cities, and from there was noticed by some publishers, and those publishers eventually came down to one publisher, Wild Wings, who invited me to an original show. And I brought one of my wild turkey paintings, and it received a lot of acclaim. And because of the process of the art world, it took some time. It was nearly 9 months later before that painting actually was printed in limited edition. And that limited edition print sold out in about 6 weeks, and much to the excitement of my publisher. And they said, you got any more paintings? And so that was the beginning of a relationship that's been over 20 years. And we've moved from one subject, whitetail, wild turkey, loons, and so on, each time kind of testing the waters whether there was a market for my paintings with that subject matter. And fortunately, it had been successful, time and again, to the point where I feel very comfortable with my publisher, and my publisher is very comfortable with me. And as long as I have the mind, hand, and eye coordination, I will hopefully continue to paint, because it's a very satisfying kind of thing to do. Success, I think, in anything, any endeavor, is hinged on the basic component that you love what you do, and I certainly love what I do as an artist. So I think from that standpoint alone, being able to make a living doing what you like to do is success. I've been blessed to have been able to ride that train, and will continue doing it.
Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed the show, and we look forward to seeing you next week right here on Common Ground. If you have a segment idea for Common Ground pertaining to North Central Minnesota, contact us at legacy@lptv.org or call us at 218-333-3022. To view this episode or any Common Ground segment, visit us at lptv.org/Common Ground. Individual segments or copies of Common Ground, please call 218-333-3020. Common Ground is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008. If you enjoyed this segment of Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground, consider making a contribution at lptv.org. If you have segment ideas pertaining to North Central Minnesota, contact us at legacy@lptv.org. Common Ground is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund by the vote of the people on November 4th, 2008.